I'm gonna be playing catch-up on SCC-related stuff for the next couple of commentaries. I apologize for not really making content related to the community I'm actually in for quite a bit, but I hope to rectify that throughout the rest of the year. Let's start with that video Blazing Larvesta did on me at the tail end of last year, which, although not atrocious, did make some points that I do feel are worth responding to. The first thing I want to note is I feel like your intro goes on a little too long. Now, mind you, this is more of a subjective point, but it takes nearly a minute before we actually see you appear in your video. I'd recommend shortening it if you can, or even splitting it up a little. I notice you have an opening graphic, then your disclaimer, and then your intro. Even placing a stinger between the disclaimer and the intro, like a lot of commentators do, would be enough to alleviate this problem. Anyway, I have nothing to comment on regarding Larvesta's context, so I'm just plain skipping that. All you need to know is he's covering my video on Brayden. Super Mario World overrated? Well, Brayden, let's see your arguments.
Super Mario World was released on the Super Nintendo as a launch title in 1990.
No, it was released on the Super Nintendo in 1991, although it did get a release on the Super Famicom in Japan a year earlier. And the Super Nintendo wasn't even released until 1991. So how could Super Mario World be the launch title for a system that wasn't out yet?
I'm pretty sure he was referring to the Japanese release, though. Yes, Super Famicom would be the correct term for the Japanese SNES, but for what I can tell, Brayden's just using Super Nintendo as an umbrella term for all the consoles' names in general.
Then Brayden's using incorrect terminology because the Super Famicom and Super Nintendo were different systems with unique libraries and accessories. The game Super Back to the Future 2, for example, was released on the Super Famicom, but not on the Super Nintendo, because it was a Japanese exclusive. Similarly, the Satellaview was not released in any area outside of Japan, making it exclusive to the Super Famicom.
Something that your own screenshots actually corroborate, might I add.
Larvesta makes no attempt to explain why this is the case.
This becomes even more evident when you consider what he points out about Super Mario World's Game Boy Advance release.
Then, it was in the Super Mario Advance series in 2001 for Japan, and all other regions got the game in 2002. So why does other regions get the game almost a half a year later?
I don't know, translating?
I have no idea what that's supposed to prove, other than that Brayden can differentiate the release dates for the same game in different regions, but that backs up my point and serves as evidence that he was simply making a mistake when he said Super Mario World was released on the Super Nintendo in 1990 and not the Super Famicom. Remember, Brayden made no attempt to differentiate the release of Super Mario World in Japan versus the United States. He only said it came out on the Super Nintendo in 1990, which, by the way, if he is using it as an umbrella term like you suggest, that still wouldn't make any sense. Not just for the reason I already discussed, but also because the game didn't just come out in 1990. Given it was released in South Korea and the United States in 1991, and then saw release in Europe and Australia in 1992, all of which were on those countries' equivalents to the Super Nintendo. And by the way, this is the first thing he says about this game in this video, and it's just wrong! And this is just one of several factual errors I found in this review, by the way. Here are some more.
So before we go any further, I feel the need to point out an annoying structural choice that Ephraim makes throughout his video, where he just bounces around various parts of Brayden's video to argue against, making it very difficult to follow along with where in the original video Ephraim is arguing against. Like, I'm not going to say the structure of criticism is innately bunk. I know plenty of reviewers criticize works throughout various points of contention instead of just going from point A to point B. However, with how Ephraim is going to randomly leap from part to part of Brayden's video, it makes it a lot harder to verify what Brayden is saying and where to anyone who hasn't already seen the original video.
Okay, I'm not unwilling to grant you at least some of those points regarding nonlinear commentating. However, I am bothered by your choice to use the word random, because these aren't random jumps. I'm grouping topics together for the sake of ease. The clip you played saw me saying that I was going to show you some factual errors. therefore providing a transition into the next thing I'm going to show. It's also implied that if I don't specifically take time to comment on what I'm about to show you before I do such, that is because it falls under the umbrella of factual errors. There is a structure here, albeit a more unorthodox one.
Speaking of Mario Advanced, he brings it up near the end of the video and just makes this absolutely strange statement. This at its core is pretty much an enhanced port. There's no drastic change from the original. But damn it, I'm disappointed that they didn't choose this game to have support for the e-reader. In the GBA version, there's minor fixes like saves, power-ups, behaviors, some minor stuff. The ability to play as Luigi in single player, Luigi no longer being a palette swap of Mario and instead being close to how he was in Super Mario Bros. 2. Something which is noticeable through looking at his own footage, by the way, given he's playing as Luigi while he's saying this. Along with him actually mentioning the fact that in the original SNES version, Luigi is just a palette swap of Mario in this very video. Luigi was basically using the same sprites as Mario, but the colors are opposite, so...
Which, I should note, he also complains about using this incredibly bizarre strain of logic.
It's not like this machine runs on rotary dials and punch cards. It's been almost 5 years, so I know it's not a hardware issue.
So it can't be a hardware issue because it's been 5 years since the release of the original Super Mario Bros., where Mario and Luigi were palette swaps of each other. I'm really fucking confused by this point.
So Ephraim actually makes a pretty decent point about how Mario World's Game Boy Advance port isn't entirely a copy-paste of the original by using Luigi's altered gameplay style as an example, only to then miss the point of Brayden's joke about Mario and Luigi just being recolors of one another. Brayden's complaint stems from the fact that Mario and Luigi's sprites have been nearly identical to one another for half a decade.
Brayden didn't say that, he just pointed out that it had been half a decade since the original Super Mario Bros. Okay, well, why would that be something he'd expect? My point was that there's no reason to believe the Super Nintendo would have the ability to do such with the evidence Brayden provided. You pointing out how the SNES is more powerful than the NES, although true, doesn't really mean anything on its own. If only because the Super Nintendo also had its own set of limitations, and Brayden had failed to provide evidence that this wasn't one of them. Yes, the Super Nintendo is more powerful than the NES. However, it can't do everything. It can't even do what an N64 could have. And an N64 couldn't do what a GameCube could have, and a GameCube couldn't do what a Wii could have, and so on and so forth. But every one of these systems had their own limitations. That's one of the reasons why new systems are created in the first place.
I have to wonder, I mean, Game Boy is basically a portable Nintendo, right?
No.
Why couldn't they just make it look like the
What?
Mario Brothers? I mean...
Are you joking?
Seems as if it would have...
Do you think they chose the four-color thing? Like, you know, we could do...
The Game Boy could have easily had PS3 graphics.
That's kind of...
You know, we have the power of an NES here, but let's just limit our games, just for no good reason.
I just want to stress, you didn't even really clarify Brayden's point. You added a few things that weren't there, and then repeated it back at me as if that disproved my issue, but it doesn't.
That said, Brayden, I have to ask why you didn't go with Mario 2 USA to compare Mario and Luigi's sprites to. With Mario 1, the most you're providing is that Mario World is stagnating somewhat in the graphical department. Had you went with Mario 2 USA, you'd be giving at least the SNES version less ground to stand on with Mario and Luigi's sprites, given that, as Ephraim pointed out, the former game gave the brothers more distinct sprites from one another, that game being a Doki Doki Panic reskin itself be Hoover damned. In other words, Mario World not giving Luigi sprites to differentiate from his brother would look even worse, since a game from the previous console generation was able to do that just fine.
You see, I like this part because Larvesta essentially admits I was right. My point was that Brayden had not given me any reason to believe what he desired was reasonable. I'm not saying it was or wasn't, for the record. I was merely pointing out that Brayden failed to make his argument convincingly. In fact, I know it's possible because Luigi was given an entirely different sprite in the version of Super Mario World that appeared in the Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World cartridge. Larvesta then states that I misunderstood Brayden's argument and then provides a more detailed refutation, albeit through focusing on a different aspect of why it's incorrect. So I'm forced to wonder, what exactly was the issue with my point?
Yeah, this game doesn't break any boundaries in terms of graphics. Now that title goes to Doom running on a stellar 2 frames per second.
I'm not quite sure what Brayden means by this. I think he's trying to say the graphics of Mario World aren't all that impressive compared to other games at the time. And while that's at best debatable, the fact that he doesn't explain how that is, or even what he means by breaking boundaries, just makes this another meaningless statement.
I don't actually have a problem with Ephraim's point here.
Then why are you leaving it in? Especially given you go on to criticize Brayden, even though there's an entire section of the video later on dedicated to specifically criticizing Brayden. Wouldn't it have made more sense to place your complaint with Brayden's point there as opposed to here, when you're still in criticize Ephraim mode?
The overall gameplay is fine, the controls are tight, which I like. The difficulty is up there though, and I think this was a hardware thing rather than a developer thing. The enemies spawn right where you're going 90% of the time, and it doesn't help that there's a bit of popping in this game.
So I'll ignore the obviousness of saying the enemies are spawning where you're trying to go because, well, yeah, they're trying to stop you from getting where you're trying to go. Spawning in front of you, in between where you are and that final destination seems like a pretty obvious idea to me.
I'm pretty sure Brayden's arguing from a gameplay standpoint rather than a narrative one. Like, no duh, the enemies are trying to get in Mario's way, but that doesn't mean them doing so can't hurt the gameplay experience for Brayden if the enemies are placed in spots where they're annoying to counter, or otherwise make the level more unfair than it should be.
But from a gameplay perspective, the same point applies. The entire reason you have enemies in video games is to serve as obstacles to keep you from getting to the goal. Obviously, the logical place to put them are in between the starting point and the ending point, aka right in your way. The rest of the interjection is just you adding nuances that weren't in Brayden's original statement. Yes, obviously enemy placement can be an issue with a video game. All I was saying is that Brayden's statement was incredibly obvious. Oh, and there's also this little part from the same section of the video.
It could have been the fact that every video game company had to keep the video game renters in mind.
He says, talking about a game that was bundled with the Super Nintendo, meaning Nintendo didn't have to keep renters in mind, because if you had an SNES, you were essentially guaranteed to have a copy of Super Mario World.
Except not every Super NES system came with Super Mario World. There's plenty of other games that the SNES was bundled with, and for all Nintendo knew, some people may have bought one of those instead, and thus initially missed out on Super Mario World. Doing a bit of digging, A Link to the Past and Donkey Kong Country were just two examples I found in North America alone.
Hence my use of the word essentially, because although there were exceptions, the Super Nintendo was, usually at least, bundled with a copy of Super Mario World. This fact is also believed to be the reason why Super Mario World attained the status of the best-selling Super Nintendo game of all time.
And that's not even the only time remembering the game was sold with the system makes a point fall apart. Take this line, for example. Yes, I understand that you need a game that isn't too easy for people to fly. Yeah, you don't want this game to be too difficult where they won't play this game in general and not buy the game. But they didn't have to buy the game. They just needed to buy the Super Nintendo, and the game was included. This point doesn't make any fucking sense.
Also, yeah, nobody's going to want to buy a game like Super Mario World. Hence why it sold 20 million copies in the United States.
That is not at all what Brayden said. He was saying that people don't want to buy games that are unfairly difficult in general.
Which he repeatedly said he believed Super Mario World was.
Adding on to this, since you're going to bring up Lost Levels as an example of a game notorious for its difficulty, that game only sold 2.5 million copies in Japan, on top of initially being denied an international localization due to its cheap difficulty, ultimately lending credence to Brayden's claim.
That had nothing to do with difficulty. That had to do with the fact that Mario 2 Japan was only released for the Famicom Disk System, an add-on to the original Famicom, of which 4.5 million units were sold. 2.5 million people buying a game for a add-on 4.5 million people own is actually spectacular, truth be told, and in no way lends credence to what Brayden said.
I would say the real issue is the game is kind of short. Just think about it. If we were to calculate the normal route and see how long that takes to get to the end of the game doesn't take long to get to the final boss and finish the game because many people would consider that if you beat the final boss, then you finish the game. And the levels in the Star World are just bonuses.
No, not really, at least not when compared to other games from that time period. Super Mario World takes about 5 hours to beat, assuming you are only going after the main objectives. Meanwhile, it takes 4 hours to do the same with the original Donkey Kong Country, 3.5 hours to do the same with Mega Man X, and between 4 and 5 hours to beat Super Castlevania 4.
This does not debunk anything. Yeah, looking through similar titles from the time on How Long to Beat, Mario World does appear to be about average length just to finish, but for all we know, Brayden may consider the other games you brought up to be too short as well, or think Mario World should be longer on its own merits independent of its genre.
In that case, his complaints are entirely based on not understanding how video games and technology work. The reason why I mentioned how long it was relative to other games from that era is because that's a good indicator of what was considered long and short at the time. There's no objective standard of a long and short video game. You do know that, right? By SNES game standards, especially SNES platformer standards, Super Mario World is longer than average. If you want it to be even longer past that point, then the most I'm really going to have to say to you is, you fail to take into account the fact that a game can only be so long depending on the technology that's used to make it. Who's to say the SNES is even capable of a longer game? You need to prove that. Anyway, Larvesta then goes on to start criticizing Brayden's video, and I also have a few issues with that, so let's go through those real quick.
Basically, Yoshi is a safeguard. He can jump on pretty much any enemy and kill them instantly. If not, he can jump on dangerous surfaces, and that would normally hurt Mario and stand on them. Eat anything you can pick up, either store it or just swallow. Yeah, he looks like a depressed lizard. Come on, he's a bit too droopy. Or a bit too excited. And then eating multiple fruits gives you a power-up. And B, a jump pad. Yeah, this was the most brutal method, but it does save you from losing a life in the game. So which one's worse, getting hit with the Super Nintendo or being fucked over by the Super Nintendo on how difficult Super Mario World is? And then an item box for you to save an item inside for emergencies. And then the 7 Koopalings. Yeah, these were really annoying. On to Mario Party 2. The Koopalings return from Super Mario Bros. 3, which they haven't got any better. It goes from the order Iggy, Morton, Lemmy, Ludwig, Roy, Wendy, and Larry. I mean, these battles are fine, yet it's so strict on the timing, or they're just not cooperating in general. This is what it looks like when the Koopalings are cooperating, and then when they don't. Not until 4.
Okay, you're gonna have to forgive me for playing so much of the video at once, but there's quite a bit to unpack here. The biggest problem shown in this segment? The video clips you showed do a poor job corroborating your complaints. Your first clip, talking about how Yoshi can stand directly on dangerous platforms, just shows him being chased away by a Wiggler, while the clips of you fighting the Koopalings don't show how the fights are RNG heavy, instead showing you just being poor at fighting them. Speaking of the Koopalings, how about we talk about that JPEG you showed? Really, Brayden? Why couldn't you have just found a version of the image that doesn't just have a jarring white background behind it? You do show in other parts of your video that you are able to overlay images over a background, so to have this random 2010 era low quality JPEG slapped over a black void of nothingness comes off as incredibly jarring compared to what editing you do show off in the rest of your video.
You know, I normally don't play this card, but to quote you...
Please don't start jumping on his case for non-issues.
That clip, by the way, was in response to me pointing out that Brayden made a factually incorrect statement. Specifically the one discussed at the very start of the video, where Brayden confused the Super Nintendo with the Super Famicom. So that's a non-issue, but him using a JPEG in a manner that looks kind of bad for a couple of seconds is... Your standards are incredibly arbitrary and, in my opinion at least, nonsensical. And by the way, your standards don't have to conform to mine. That's one of the great things about this community. You can think that's important, I don't have to. I can think a rather small factual error is important, and you don't have to. The only thing I ask is you don't pretend like your subjective standards for what is and isn't important are the end-all be-all.
During the 90s, Nintendo felt like they were in decline. They kinda were, but Nintendo tried to be cool with all the teens. That's right. They made the Play Aloud series. This was the thing Nintendo was trying to bank on to win back an audience. I don't know if it worked or not. The only thing I know is that screamed 90s and early 2000s. They dipped their toes in other things too, like the Best Play Here, Who Are You? and the one I consider to be a part of this too is the more recent of the 3DS era, There is No Play Like It. I kinda like the 3DS one. I remember this one more at Christmas time though, but I think it was also everywhere else too.
And this relates to Super Mario World. How? Like, yeah, the level titles in the Super World were named after slang terms from the 90s, but why bring up stuff like Who Are You and There's No Play Like It? It feels distracting.
Because he wanted to go into a brief diatribe about how the names of these levels connect to Nintendo's marketing at the time, before also going on a little bit of a digression about how Nintendo uses similar marketing tactics today. Even if you're going to say it wasn't all that relevant and should have been left out of the video, which I do agree with, you have to acknowledge there was a structural reason for placing it there. Anyway, final thoughts. Again, this video isn't atrocious by any stretch of the imagination, but it had enough problems to where I felt the commentary was worthwhile. Good night, and good luck.